So hello everyone online and in the room. It's 2 p.m. in the UK, and we are welcoming you all to another Centre for Global Higher Education webinar. We're continuing a theme we've had for the last few weeks around access to university. We started with a paper on private universities in Africa and in outreach in India. This week we're coming closer to home, and we are talking about access to Oxford. And Ed Penn is with me here in the seminar room, and his title is Natalie starts with access not taking people who are already superstars, ? So he's done some really interesting doctoral research on the undergraduate foundation year. Hey, welcome everyone. And he submitted his thesis this week. Well done, congratulations. That's great news.
Finally.
And so this is very, very fresh off the press research. So I'll hand over to Ed to talk for half an hour or so. As always, please do put your questions in the chat, and I can invite you to come forward and ask questions. And there'll be a good bit of time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, the screen in the room is yours, Ed.
Thanks, David. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Bear with me. Hopefully we can see that. So before I get started, I just want to quickly clarify for people who aren't familiar with the project what it's not. So this is not an evaluation of the Astrophoria Foundation Year. Instead, I wanted to use the introduction of the year to think about what kind of norms, narratives, constructions are salient for Oxford's undergraduate admissions process, so the mainstream undergraduate admissions process. Now, the foundation year is useful for this because it provides a really nice point of kind of comparison. There are some divergences and some things which are similar, and I'm going to kind of explore those with you as we work through. But it's very much not a does this work? It's more using it as kind of a vehicle to explore what's already there and where those differences lie. The title of the talk is paraphrased from one of my participants. So they said access is not about taking people who are already superstars. And I think this really speaks to the kind of the relationship between kind of merit and fairness that I was trying to explore. So lots of the kind of core issues of the research focus on this kind of relationship between merit, what we mean by merit, and what that means for kind of fairness, social mobility, and social and educational background when we are assessing people for admission to universities like Oxford. Firstly, why does this matter? I think three things it's important to kind of highlight here. First, Oxford has symbolic power in the UK HE sector. So there's a fantastic paper by Loma, Papadou, and I think I do from 2017, 2018, which kind of talks about the way that the UK's international higher education policy is kind of structured around the ideal of Oxford and Cambridge. And there's kind of quite a lot of research that talks about this, the construction of the HE sector as a kind of mirror image of the ancient English universities. So I think there's this way in which Oxford and Cambridge shape almost kind of diffractively our images of what a university is and what it's meant to be. Second, we have the kind of perception of unfairness or elitism in the University of Oxford's admissions processes. Now, I think most people within the university and most people who work on this would say that's not a kind of overt bias towards people who are more advantaged. But if you ask somebody on the street, that may not be the case. There's a kind of sustained public and media perception that this is something we need to think about. And so I think analysing the ways in which merit and fairness play out in this process is really, really important. Third, there are tangible advantages associated with attending the University of Oxford. So there's a statistic paper by Shana and Noden from a few years back, which talks about the kind of professional advantages to attending Oxford. Various kind of research has demonstrated that it can give you a quicker entry into elite professional occupations, and your early career earnings can be higher as well. So there are kind of real tangible advantages associated with attending a university like Oxford. In the context of the UK's widening participation kind of sector, there's been a big shift in in kind of the way that we regulate in the last 10 years. So this should say 2018, not 2016. But in 2018, we saw the introduction of the Office for Students. This is a much more proactive regulator than the previous body. The essential kind of core difference is that the previous body asked universities to say what they were doing about widening participation, so to articulate the kind of outreach activities they were undertaking. The Office for Students asks universities to demonstrate impact. So what have those activities achieved? This is a real kind of seismic shift. So universities from 2018 start producing much more detailed plans called access and participation plans, which outline how they are trying to widen admission. And this is particularly true for selective universities. Now, my participants discussed this, the link between the introduction of the access and participation plan as a kind of regulatory tool and the shift to kind of more innovative and potentially radical schemes to widen participation at Oxford, such as the Astrophoria Foundation Year. I'd probably put Opportunity Oxford, which is a kind of bridging course for mainstream students, into that bracket as well. What you're looking at here is a graph that shows the admission rate for free school meals versus non-free school meals eligible students. This is a marker of disadvantage that's commonly used.
Shocking.
Yeah, this is a marker of disadvantage that's commonly used to articulate essentially poverty. So the blue line at the bottom is students who are eligible for free school meals, defined as disadvantaged. You can see that's kind of essentially flat over the last few years. There's a little bit of an upward tick in 2022-23, but Oxford's internal data shows this dropping back to 6.7% from 10.3, so back down to that flat line. So despite progress on some other measures, free school meals, which is the measure most commonly associated or tightly tied to disadvantage, has been pretty flat for years. In light of this, Oxford introduces the Astrophoria Foundation Year. So it's a year-long bridging course admitting around about 50 students. That's the kind of target. In the first year of intake, the actual number of students admitted was slightly lower. And it's a course that lasts 1 year, is completely free to the students who take part. They receive a stipend to live on. They are kind of accommodated within the university, and they aren't charged tuition fees. It's only open to acutely disadvantaged home status students. So we are not just talking about students who've attended state-maintained schools, but people who've perhaps been in care, who've been long-term eligible for free school meals, who have refugee status. So very acute kind of intersections of disadvantage. The key part is that the grade requirements for accessing the foundation year are 3 grades below the standard offer for the cognate course. So if we take a course like PPE, where the standard offer is 3 A's at A-level, students would be required to attain 3 B's to access the PPE stream of the Astrophoria course. And this matters because lots of the previous research on Oxford's admissions process has demonstrated that it's quite meritocratically driven. And the specific variant of meritocracy, which is adopted, is kind of prior attainment. Now, I term this kind of credentialist meritocracy. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I think the the picture in the mainstream admissions round has shifted quite a lot since that previous research took place. And I'm going to kind of describe that in a second. Firstly, just a quick overview of my methodology. It's a case study approach. So it's conceptualizing Oxford as a kind of bounded but permeable site of research. I employed 3 data production techniques. So the principal one is semi-structured interviews, conducted interviews with 39 academic participants and 11 student participants. They are drawn, so 75 interviews in total from 50 participants. They're drawn from 21 colleges, 16 different subjects. So the academic participants included people like senior tutors, admissions tutors for particular subjects at colleges, senior university decision makers, and undergraduate course leads. And the student participants were all people who had some form of representative role for different student bodies they were part of. So for instance, they might have been an access or a class rep for their undergraduate college. I undertook 22 observations of planning meetings where kind of policy process and teaching decisions were being made. And I analysed 146 documents which were drawn from the university and its subsidiary websites. Quick note on positionality and kind of ethical issues. I kind of thought of myself as a kind of precarious insider when conducting this research. So what I mean by that is my access to the research site was dependent on my participants wanting me to be there, right? So Oxford is a very kind of small world. And my participants were understandably, sometimes quite nervous about sharing their views on what's a kind of sensitive topic within the university. So I was constantly kind of negotiating my positionality in relation to them and in relation to the roles they held and the roles I held in the university. A good example of this, at one point I applied for a teaching position where one of my participants was on the panel, and I had to kind of think about how to negotiate that. So there are, what I kind of flag up here is there are some limitations on the data which is kind of reproducible and usable in research outputs. Some participants wanted to remain completely anonymous. Some wanted to retain control of the data and kind of sign off quotes I was using. I'm happy to talk more about that at the end. These are my research questions. So essentially, you can kind of think of them as a kind of temporal progression. So firstly, I wanted to think about the mainstream undergraduate admissions process. How are my academic stakeholders particularly constructing what merit and fairness meant within that process? How do these constructions interact with what they think of the foundation year? So how do their conceptions of what, for instance, prior attainment means inflect how they conceive of what the foundation year means? And how do they attempt to implement their conceptions of fairness and merit in the context of the AFY's introduction? I'm going to talk more about that last research question towards the end. It's easier to show you through kind of empirical data. My conceptual framework is mostly based in Bourdieu's work. For a very quick overview for people who don't know, Bourdieu thinks about kind of social reproduction, essentially. So he posits that people have what he calls a habitus, a kind of preconceived way of being, an embodied set of practices that help them navigate the social world. And that this habitus is kind of embedded in their or generated from their early life experiences. It's kind of malleable, so it can shift as you move along, but it's kind of relatively inbuilt. So those shifts tend to be small, gradual. He also talks about the congruence between your habitus and the social field that you are situated within. So he talks about the idea that where your habitus is very congruent with the field that you're operating in, you feel like a fish in water. You don't notice any kind of jars or mismatches between your practice and the practice that the field accepts or legitimizes. This dotted line that you can see here, doxa, refers to the kind of bounds of possibility which participants who are situated within a field perceive. So these are the kind of the bounds of the thinkable, the bounds of the things which are seen as kind of socially possible. I'm going to come back to this framework as we move along and explain how I applied it to my research. The second concept I use is institutional work. This is borrowed from organizational studies, and it's essentially the idea that actors who are kind of situated within a field can be both constrained but also agentic in the actions they undertake. So this is taken from Lawrence and Sotheby, who are the people who kind of came up with this. Institutional work is relational in the sense that institutional actors are able to work with institutionally defined logics of effect or appropriateness as they attempt to shape those processes as they work to create, maintain, or disrupt institutions. So essentially, institutional agents are situated, constrained, but they still have agency. And they're thinking about logics of kind of effect or appropriateness, which I think we can see the links to kind of habitus and field there, as they kind of undertake the action they are engaging in within the institution. So my first research question, what values govern admissions? I found that unlike the previous research, which kind of covers this, there is a much broader spectrum in place in Oxford today than I think there was perhaps 10 years ago with regard to how people conceptualize merit. So this is a quote which captures it really nicely, I think. The most salient debate in recent years is the extent to which contextual factors related to candidates affect their ability to demonstrate academic excellence. Lots of my participants conceptualized the idea of a spectrum. So almost everybody, a tiny handful of people didn't adhere to kind of traditional ideas of merit. They kind of questioned the idea of merit as a thing. But the vast majority of people subscribed to merit in some form. But you have more credentialist forms of merit, where we're thinking about prior attainment, so exam grades, the absolute scores people receive in interviews or admissions tests. And we have kind of contextualist notions of merit, where those absolute scores, grades, prior attainment are thought about within the context that an applicant has come from. So we have this kind of spectrum where participants are leaning one way or the other. Very few people are at kind of the radical extreme ends of the spectrum. Most people recognize that there is some form of credentialism and some form of contextual assessment necessary. But people do have kind of inclinations or leanings one way or the other. And it does tend to impact how they view the Astrophoria Foundation Year. Quick examples of what that looks like. So this is a participant who is describing colleagues they see as credentialist. A-level grades are immutable. They represent a kind of divinely ordained truth that cannot be superseded. It's not our business at Oxford to take account of background. It's our business to find the people who answer the questions quickest, smartest, and best, and take them. So that would be a very credentialist notion of meritocracy. On the other hand, you have participants who think really, really carefully about the context that their applicants have kind of come from. So for instance, this person, even if on paper they don't look so strong, they just have to be good enough. Those students who might not look so strong on paper, or even maybe not be so strong in the interview, and quite often aren't so strong on the test, but show lots of promise, they're likely to shoot forward really fast. So this is the idea that admissions tutors, or some admissions tutors, are taking really strong notice of the educational research which demonstrates that your social and educational background impacts your attainment. This is well established in the literature. So it's interesting that this very credentialist view is still kind of prominent for some people. But I do want to flag up that it shifted a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. The last comparable study on this was in 2007, and that's Zimmer's DPhil thesis. And that finds essentially a very strong notion of credentialism, where contextualism is kind of thought about and then dismissed. Here, we've got a much more even split between the two conceptions. I conceptualize these different kind of leanings or orientations as multiple institutional habituses. So for Bourdieu, the habitus is a kind of personal, embedded and embodied set of practices. The institutional habitus is a kind of conceptual outgrowth, and it thinks about, or the way I've conceptualized it at least, thinks about your embodied, embedded practices on behalf of the institution you are part of. So what do you do for, in relation to, perhaps in opposition to, the institution you are situated within? I think we can think of credentialist and contextualist meritocracy as varying forms of institutional habitus. It's quite unusual to think about multiple institutional habituses existing at the same time, but I think it overcomes some of the objections to the concept, which people at Will Atkinson have raised. Happy to talk about that more towards the end if people are interested. The second kind of finding about the mainstream round I want to flag up is this idea of kind of autonomous academic judgment as a doxic boundary. So we talked about doxa earlier as the idea of the socially imaginable or the socially possible. It's the kind of horizon of social action that we see as possible within a social field. And regardless of whether people were more credentially or contextually inclined in terms of merit, almost everybody situated this idea of individuals making judgments about their subject as a completely unquestionable principle. Okay, so it's a very kind of personalized and very highly autonomous action. So this participant is talking about conversations with their colleagues. I want to nearly always say, this is your decision. Ultimately, academic judgment is not challengeable. Tell me what the judgment is, what the basis is for the decision, and we will go with your judgment. Now, I think this is interesting because this kind of doxic boundary allows these multiple institutional habituses to flourish. Because it doesn't say what the habitus should be, it just defines the kind of bounds of legitimacy in which people can act. You have room for these kind of plural habituses to evolve. And I think that's really interesting because it creates these quite radically different outcomes in some senses. So we can kind of see the kind of hypothetical situation where if you were assessed as an applicant by somebody who was very heavily kind of credentialist in the meritocratic leanings or very heavily contextualist, you might get kind of quite different outcomes depending on the profile of the applicant that you were. So this is my kind of theorization of the mainstream admissions ecosystem. You have two institutional habituses, more credentialist, more contextualist, bounded within the field of doxa. This tag here that says RIH, I'm going to come to in a second. The RIH is the idea of the relational institutional habitus. This is a new concept. It's one I developed as part of the thesis, and it stems from the idea. kind of the idea of like, well, how do we stabilize these very different, potentially tensioned and conflicting habituses within one social field? How is it possible that they can kind of coexist? So I'm thinking about this, and the relational institutional habitus is essentially the idea that it's an overarching concept which tells you not what your embedded practices should be, but how you should respond to the embedded practices of others, which are legitimate within that space. So I think what this looks like in the Oxford setting is essentially deference. I think there's a kind of recognition that you, as an admissions tutor, have autonomy within your subject, within your college, and that you might disagree with others, but you essentially need to be deferent and kind of quite laissez-faire about the decisions they're making, even if the form of meritocracy they subscribe to is quite radically different to your own. I think this kind of what this looks like in terms of institutional work is kind of maintenance. There's agentic action undertaken to maintain the institution, to stabilize it. So, for instance, we have these quotes. By and large, the discussions are friendly and nice. It's not a secret. Everyone knows which two members of staff are likely to have the greatest tensions, but there's a sense of collegiality, of staying in your lane, and essentially kind of deferring to your colleagues within the area of expertise they are meant to be responsible for. It respects the idea of kind of autonomous academic judgment as a doxic principle, because you're not treading on people's toes, essentially. Sometimes we end up having conversations about exactly when we expect potential to be realized. They end up happening. And again, we've got this idea that there are multiple different conceptions of what that looks like within those discussions. But this is essentially a kind of friendly, nice, deference, and collegial kind of conversation. You don't get people telling their colleagues what to do. What I think happens in the context of the AFY is that the program presents kind of challenges to that doxa of autonomous academic judgment. I think that happens for a couple of reasons. First, the admissions process takes place slightly differently to the mainstream admissions process. So normally for undergraduate mainstream admissions, you would apply to a particular college and you would be assessed within that college and potentially with interviews elsewhere as well. And then the college makes the decision about whether to admit you or not. For the Astrophoria Foundation Year, you apply to the program and you are assessed within the entire cohort by a panel of people who might be representing different colleges who are taking part. So you as a college tutor may not necessarily see the student who you end up with who is on the Astrophoria Foundation Year and subsequently on the course that you teach. Now, this is a really radical shift, and you can see how it challenges this doxic idea of making decisions for yourself. You're kind of entrusting the admissions decision, which is a really central part of how admissions processes at Oxford work, to somebody else. And this is really, really kind of troubling for the idea of autonomous academic judgment, right? I think the second thing is teaching. So again, teaching practices at Oxford for undergraduates are typically quite private, quite personally determined. You as a tutor have lots of leeway on autonomy to decide what you want to do with your students. And I think the idea of a centrally determined or a more tightly centrally determined curriculum, which employs more kind of codified pedagogic practice, again, challenges this idea of academic autonomy. I think what this does is to kind of dissolve the relational institutional habitus of deference. So where previously you'd kind of let colleagues get on with what they want to do in the knowledge that it's legitimate within the idea of autonomous academic judgment, we see people taking much more proactive stances and engaging with much more proactive forms of institutional work. So rather than just kind of maintaining by not interfering or maintaining by being deferent, we see moves towards selective working relationships, and I think the legitimization of active opposition in a way which would be really, really striking and rare were it to happen in the mainstream admissions round. I think we see these kind of more disruptive forms of institutional work emerging, and what they look like are essentially, I think, compartmentalization or permeation. I'm going to talk about that in the final section. These two quotes are from the same participant. And they are comparing Opportunity Oxford, which is the kind of bridging program I spoke about at the start, to the foundation year. So they're saying that they think Opportunity Oxford has been a success because essentially the program let people bend the rules. The price for everyone signing up from day one is letting people bend the criteria in whatever direction they want. Doing that through a process that's been in effect 100% consensual. It's quite a striking contrast. On the other hand, the foundation year didn't face this kind of immediate and kind of potentially enthusiastic buy-in. So a relatively small number of colleges took part from the start. And there's quite a lot of persuasion that went on in order to bring those colleges on board. And this participant theorizes that this is because the foundation year is more prescriptive and more centrally determined in its admissions processes, its teaching criteria, and just how it was going to run. So the Opportunity Oxford program is devolved to colleges. Colleges make their decisions within it as a framework, whereas the foundation year is kind of centrally determined and run outside of college purview. I think the fact that this participant highlights this distinction really speaks to the relevance of autonomous academic judgment as a doxic principle and what happens when you challenge it. So, for instance, a quote from a participant, doing things centrally is not a very good way of persuading bloody-minded academics. We have a history at faculty meetings where people come in and tell us what we should do, of doubling down and putting our finger up. So we can see really clearly that there's a real opposition among many of these academic participants to being what they would see as being dictated to centrally. They really value and prize this autonomy to construct their own admissions practices, their own teaching practices. A subsequent quote from this participant: I know one of my colleagues well. That colleague phoned me up and tried to persuade me that going in was a good idea. So that's been the informal process. So we see this process of kind of selective engagement via particular colleagues through personal relationships. Again, like a very kind of autonomously and personally driven route of accession to the AFY rather than a central imposition. I think the responses via institutional work that I've seen can be broadly categorized via the dichotomy of kind of compartmentalization, keeping the foundation year separate, or permeation, integrating some of its principles into mainstream admissions and teaching practice. Here's a couple of the examples. I'm only going to talk about two of these just for time's sake, but compartmentalization, so keeping it really separate. I think we saw this in admissions through shifting boundaries of responsibility. So both colleges and departments kind of oscillating back and forth between wanting to be involved and then not engaging in processes. I think the effect of this is to keep the foundation year from kind of integrating too closely into some of their inbuilt practices. The college allocation process. So when colleges were selecting which successful students they wanted, some colleges engaged in this kind of work whereby they were extremely selective about which students they wanted to admit and thereby retained some kind of autonomy. And then the confirmation process. So there was a kind of very rigid decision to ensure that mainstream eligible foundation year eligible students who'd missed their grades weren't accepted onto the foundation year. Okay, and that decision is kind of interesting, an interesting example of kind of compartmentalization, keeping that separation. In teaching, we primarily saw this through the discourse of ensuring efficacy. So concerns that the foundation year might not bring people up to speed quickly enough for them to then take part in year one of the mainstream undergraduate course. And then this more conceptual idea of protecting the integrity of tutorial teaching. So some participants really objected to the idea of centrally prescribed courses, sorry, not just centrally prescribed courses, but centrally prescribed resources and teaching practices. They saw this as threatening to the kind of pluralism and I guess equitable ecosystem that they see the tutorial system as representing. On the other hand, we see some examples of kind of integration and permeation. So in admissions practice, some participants kind of questioned the attainment bounds for eligibility. So there were kind of discussions about whether students who would be eligible on the basis of their attained grades should be allowed to apply for the foundation year and be considered. And some participants argued that they should, because in practice, although they got the grades for standard admission, say 3As, 3As doesn't really make you that competitive in the process. So they argue that they should be considered for the foundation year. And that kind of elides this division between the foundation year and the mainstream process. The other thing in the admissions process would be assessment of interview performance. So lots of the majority of the participants I spoke to said that the performance of interview of applicants who were successful wasn't radically different, or in some cases even discernibly different from mainstream undergraduate applicants. So the difference is there in terms of grades and prior attainment, but the actual interview performance looks almost identical for some people. In teaching, I think the easiest way to see this is the adoption of pedagogic practice. So people talk about taking things they'd learned through teaching on the foundation year and applying it in their mainstream undergraduate practice, and their undergraduate students liking it. I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. They also do this through kind of broader, more general comparison to undergraduate students, so questioning the divide between AFY students and the type of students they are, and then undergraduate students and the type of students they are. And then lastly, this kind of discourse of shifting institutional narratives. So one participant who spoke at length about this said, I don't think it really matters if the AFY is a good program or not. I think what matters is that it shifts people's perceptions of who can do well at Oxford. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of take. I'm happy to talk more about that at the end of the presentation. Last thing I want to just quickly show you is some examples of this. So this is an example of kind of permeation within pedagogic practice. So this person talks about an idea they've taken from the foundation year teaching and into their undergraduate teaching. Their students now spend the first quarter of a class comparing and contrasting their answers to a model answer they've been given. And even the students that get the right answer spot they're maybe not telling the story in the right way. That was an idea that came from foundation year teaching. So then they talk about the specifics of this. I've kept my side working separate from my main maths. You can see really clearly what I'm doing. I've not forgotten my units. Look at my diagram. Every single line is labeled. So we've got this kind of transference of pedagogic principles and practices from foundation year teaching into undergraduate teaching. On the other hand, an example of compartmentalization. This was this kind of discourse of protecting the integrity of tutorial teaching. So this participant worries about the extent to which we don't think students can grow for themselves and acquire those skills autodidactically. This person wants there to be a place in higher education where it's okay for educators and students to share that expectation. They then go on to say they've modified their pedagogy to some extent. What I haven't done is make the material that they read any less challenging. So this is this kind of discursive attempt to separate what the foundation year is doing from what this participant thinks students should be doing in the mainstream undergraduate process. So just two really quick examples for time's sake. But hopefully that gives you a sense of the kind of active strategies that people are engaging in to compartmentalize or integrate or permeate the foundation year's principles into mainstream practice at Oxford. This is the first paper from the project, came out last year. So this explores the first research question, kind of the frameworks and norms which govern admissions practice at Oxford in the undergraduate sphere. Have a read if you're interested. And just my references there. Thanks very much. I'll stop there and take some questions.
Great, thank you very much, Ed. That was a high-speed run through a really interesting and sort of important case study. Obviously, I would say that because I'm in Oxford, but I think one of the things that seems to come out here is the complexity of the institution itself, and the ways in which you have an institution like Oxford, where admissions at undergraduate level is devolved to colleges, and therefore you already have a really complex ecosystem, which is, as you put it, relational. And then you also have a very strong sense of because individual tutors are teaching the students, then that sense of the devolution to their sense of what was appropriate. So I really welcome comments or thoughts from anyone online, and we have a room of people here as well. If anyone would like to start off and ask any questions, I mean, I will start then in terms of just sort of posing a question to you. You present these two relational habituses. No, rather, you present these credentialism versus contextualism, and they are interrelating within this, larger ecosystem, which you're calling relational. And then somehow this new sort of program, which is the foundation year, which is very new for Oxford, sort of disrupts the balance. That's the argument, isn't it? Yeah.
Very broadly.
Yeah. Now, I guess the question then is that those people holding a very contextualist vision, where are they getting that from? Aren't they getting it from the fact that they've been exposed to these broader debates about a much more contextual approach to admissions?
Yeah, so I think it's certainly not the case that there's this kind of simple linear relationship where people were thinking really credentially. They started doing things to do with the foundation year, and then they became contextualists. That's not what's happening here. So lots of the people who volunteered to take on those roles had already been thinking in quite contextual senses about both their admissions and their teaching practice. And I think this is one of the things that I should highlight about my sample. It's not a kind of representative or kind of numerically determined sample of Oxford, right? So the people who want to be involved in the foundation year in some way, whether that's from a kind of college perspective, a departmental perspective, they are more likely to be interested in kind of more progressive forms of admissions. They're more likely to be interested in changing things about the Oxford admissions process. And one of the things that's discussed in the thesis is the fact that although lots of participants refer to the idea of like kind of innate or extreme credentialists, very few of them actually appear in my data. And I think that's because they didn't want to talk to me. So I think enough participants refer to these people that we can be sure they exist somewhere in Oxford, but their views are not represented firsthand in the data. So it's certainly not that the AFY by itself has kind of just completely disrupted some pre-existing and stable credentialist norm and introduced contextualist ideas. I think it's far more that there's been a gradual development of more contextualist orientations. The other thing that I haven't spoken about here that lots of participants flag is the impact of improving contextual data over the last 10 to 15 years. So the fact that they view contextual data as just much more reliable and much more granular than it used to be. And I think that's a really big part of the kind of formulation of contextualist ideas within Oxford. So I think if you were to compare my research to Anna Zimder's 15 years ago now, I think that's a really big part of where that shift has come from. It's certainly not that the foundation year has just generated it from nowhere.
Good, thank you. Okay, so Elizabeth, you were the first to post the question. Do you want to come in and ask it? I think hopefully I've unmuted you.
I can see that in the chat, Elizabeth. It's easiest just answer that question here.
So if you're not able to unmute or I'll read the question actually, and then you can respond, Ed. So Elizabeth writes, demand for university places has grown, part driven by the notion that universities are looking for diversity. So there's elite university places. Endowments have grown, fees have risen, admissions have not grown in line. There's a vast gap between the demand for places and supply, and the majority of applicants are given the message they're not good enough for Oxford and other elite universities. Whilst the universities use the difficulty of getting a place as an indication of quality. I mean, yeah, these are all really important points. The demographic changes to the student bodies, with the majority of women and other minority students, mean that many alumni from past eras would not be admitted today. Is there a solution? And there's a big question for you to get going, but yeah, do you want to try and tackle some of the things coming in there?
Yeah, so something that's worth saying from a kind of as a kind of preliminary to this is that Oxford is making progress. So it would be completely unfair. The graph I showed at the start of free school meals versus non-free school meals admission is the kind of the starkest gives the starkest sense of inertia, and that's why I used it there. But in lots of ways, the university is improving. So if you look at, for instance, the participation of Polar Quintile 1 versus Polar Quintile 5 students. So Polar is a measure of how likely you are to go to university based on your local area. in England, in the UK, but doesn't work elsewhere, then there is progress there. The proportion of UK-based students being admitted from state schools versus private schools has grown dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years. So I don't think it's fair to say that Oxford's just standing still at all. I think one of the things we need to kind of focus on when we talk about the data around this is what disadvantage really means. That's why I chose to talk about free school meals, because it is very, very closely tied to your individual status, rather than your school, the area you come from. So I think that's part of the solution. I think the other part of it that I'd really point people towards thinking about is, and point stakeholders at Oxford towards thinking about, is whether some of the assumptions we make about what it means to be a rigorous, selective, academically elite university are borne out in the student experience. So one of the things I haven't spoken about here very much, but which is absolutely integral to the project, is the relationship between how participants understand the teaching environment at Oxford and the admissions process. So most undergraduate teaching at Oxford happens in small groups through tutorials. There's a very heavy focus on oracy. There's this kind of expectation that students engage with conversations on an equitable, if not equal, basis. And I don't think that's how most undergraduate students, even those from more advantaged backgrounds, experience the tutorial system in practice. So I work as a study skills tutor at 2 colleges. Students routinely tell me, I don't have any time to think, I need to write 2 essays this week. I don't think some of the things we do, which we maybe assume guarantee rigor, are actually helping our students get better at the subject rather than better at producing essays. So I think lots of the kind of change that we'd hope to see around admissions practice is actually also based in our conceptions of teaching practice. And I think that's in some ways where I would want to focus, because it's a more substantial and innate part of the university. And I think our conceptions of what that looks like for all students, not just students who are on the AFY or students who come from access backgrounds, it relates to all of those students. So yeah, we need to be focusing on that.
Good. Okay. Got a question in the room, but should we ask Joe Begbie first to come forward? Joe, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Ed. I mean, it
Welcome,
speaks
Joe.
very much to my experience.
Are you muted?
Yeah, I don't think we can hear you, Joe.
Oh. Okay.
No.
Oh,
So everyone else, perhaps is your sound?
Possibly.
If you can't hear me, then you might have to read it out.
That's so strange. Okay, so I'll read it out. So I'm so sorry, Joe. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. We are in a new room, not a room we're normally in. So your question basically was, how do we make changes where boundaries are very firm? Yeah.
Sure. So lots of the people I spoke to talked about kind of working with the willing, finding constituents who are willing to advocate for change, willing to think kind of progressively. I think in the kind of short to medium term, that's useful. But again, I think one of the things which we don't think about enough in terms of changing the views of academic stakeholders at the university is putting them in front of student voice and making them feel uncomfortable. So I was at a symposium on teaching, or study skills teaching, in January, and there was a student voice panel with no students on it. And the people who were involved, it wasn't their fault. It was just how it had been kind of arranged from the top. But one of the things I'm kind of thinking about in conjunction with Elizabeth, who's asked the next question, is how we can think kind of about juxtaposing student and university stakeholder accounts of what's happening here in uncomfortable ways, and really kind of mutually disrupt those accounts through what students tell us about what matters to their experience. So I don't have it on the slides, but one of my participants, who's a mainstream undergraduate, they attained the grades to win entry. They're kind of doing, they think, kind of fine as a kind of mid 2-1. They say, I think I'd be doing much, much better if I'd gone to a different university. Participants describe, not getting better at their work, getting better at handing things in, They described getting feedback on an essay that they'd written over Christmas, saying, "Oh, this is the best thing ever. You just spent some time on it, didn't you?" And they say, "No, you gave me time to spend on it. You didn't set it a week before it was due." And I think it was quite rare with some of my academic participants, particularly the ones who were, I think, further away from thinking about the pedagogy of the foundation year. It was quite rare for them to think about how students were actually experiencing the teaching that they designed. And I think if we can highlight that actually some things we do aren't working for all of our students, not just for students we think of as disadvantaged, and it's interesting that we put them in a different box, but like even the most advantaged people are saying, I wish I'd gone somewhere else. I think that's the key to generating that discomfort and hopefully generating some change.
Fascinating. Yeah, really interesting. Let's go to the room. Gonzalo, you can do hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is about this continuum between credentialism and contextualized merit. And you mentioned that most of the people are in an intermediate space in that continuum. And I wanted to know how that intermediate space looks like. It is a new narrative that trying to make sense of this. It is double thinking, just two contradictory ideas that are in the same narrative. How that two different ideas coexist?
Sure, it's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it because I think it's important. I don't think it's a kind of one new idea that's emerging in the center. I think instead it's lots of fragmented, conflicting, dissonant ideas. So, for example, there are lots of different ways in which people thought about contextualist admissions. So, for example, I had some participants who thought, like, I adhere really strongly to contextualized selection, but there is an academic baseline. So they can't be getting less than 3 A's. But anyone who's got 3 A's, I'm going to think really carefully about the situation you achieve 3 A's within. I had people who thought really, really carefully about contextualized admissions, but didn't want to do any form of contextualized teaching. So once people were in, if they struggle, they struggle. On the other hand, among the sort of credentialists, I had people who thought of credentialism as a way to achieve social justice ends or social mobility ends. So I had, for instance, people saying what we should basically do is radically simplify the entire admissions process. Think about getting rid of interviews. Why aren't we going into clearing and scooping up people who've got 5 A stars there but didn't think to apply at the time of where they had to? So you get these very different nuanced conceptions of either broad, leaning, and church. And I think that creates these different forms of interaction with things like the foundation year. So, for example, those contextualists who had the firm baseline, they had really interesting nuanced views on whether the foundation year was a kind of good or bad thing. So some of them said, I support it, I want to be involved because I think of these students as just different kind of students. They need different things to undergraduate students. Some didn't really like the idea of it, but went along with it because they kind of could see the broad social justice benefit. So you get these really nuanced and yeah, sometimes fragmented and conflicting ideas.
And there are different places of the university where there is more credentialist and other more contextualized. Like I'm thinking some colleges more.
I would actually really hesitate to say that. And I think that relates to this idea of autonomous academic judgment as being a kind of doxic principle. So just because a college, and this is important to make clear, just because a college has decided to take part or not take part doesn't really tell you that much about how they view contextualist versus credentialist meritocracy, I don't think. First, there were a couple of colleges who were really interested in taking part, but they had other stuff going on. So, for instance, they were building stuff around college, which meant there wasn't space to accommodate students, things like that. I think it's also important to flag up that individual tutors at colleges had the autonomy to say, yes, I want to do this, or no, I don't. So, for instance, there are lots of colleges that are taking part in the scheme, but not for every stream, because some tutors said, I don't want to do this. So I think it would be like a big oversimplification to say you have credentialist or contextualist colleges. The one thing I would maybe, well, I'd like to think about further is there was some nascent indication that there were kind of disciplinary differences in how subjects perceived merit. There's been some interesting work on this it's a paper by Kandika Housen from 2024. I can find the reference for you. Essentially talking about the way that merit is kind of interpreted in STEM subjects as potentially being more credentialist. I found some very, very nascent evidence to back that up, but it wasn't a kind of primary focus of the study. I didn't go into it in that much depth. I'd like to see someone else do it.
Great, thank you. Oh yes, Sunny.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. And I will say, as someone who studies American college admissions and used to work in admissions before graduate school, this is like really fascinating. And my question will be some context as an outsider, but also I wanted to follow up on a point that you were making about kind of autonomy and the decision making that the representatives held. So my ignorant question is, you were mentioning that in mainstream Oxford admissions, representatives from the colleges are then selecting students directly only into their college. Is that right?
So broadly speaking, yes. So for most subjects, all students will apply to a college. You can submit what's called an open application where you're randomly allocated, but you'll then just be put at a college and assessed there.
Got it.
There's a kind of primary college, and then in most subjects, you may be offered an interview at a secondary college just to kind of like give you another shot.
Mm-hmm.
And for most subjects, it's the individual tutors at that college who are kind of basically making the decision about whether you're admitted. They'll be doing so in relation to kind of thinking in relation to the entire cohort across the university, but they basically got the final call.
Got it.
There are some subjects where the department has a bigger role, so they will kind of give tutors a steer, and that's an interesting point of conflict because theoretically tutors at the college could kind of say like, no, I'm doing what I want.
Yeah.
But that would be unusual, eyebrow raising.
So the question, or what I'd like to hear more about is, if I understood it correctly, with this program, you have a panel with representatives from multiple colleges where they're not necessarily admitting into their own college. Is that correct? Or in theory, someone that they would admit could exit somewhere else. Is that right?
Yes. So certainly, so there's a panel for different. I only had access to one stream, one of the 4 streams from the FY. But in that stream, the panel was made up by representatives of different colleges. Theoretically, I think it could be the case, and I think it is the case that selectors whose college may not have been taking part may have been on the panel. But yes, most of those students will end up at colleges where they haven't been interviewed by a representative of that college.
Okay, perfect. So sorry, now I've like set the stage. And my actual question is, I'm wondering about the effect of basically not bearing the consequences of your own actions, so to speak, in a very like, maybe that's an unforgiving way. But so to speak, in the mainstream sense, you could say, well, if I admit a student who ends up struggling, like I'm going to bear the consequences, that's on me. Whereas if you admit someone who ends up struggling at another college, someone else could then go to you and say, hey, well, what were you doing? And I'm wondering if that has an effect on the kind of merit conceptualization that they have, if that leans them more towards a credentialist, which is more objective, and maybe shields them from the kind of subjectivity.
So you certainly see that kind of risk aversion in the mainstream process. So one of my participants, there's this quote where they essentially say, I'd love to take this person, but I can't bring myself not to take this person who I think can be relied upon to do at least okay. Right. So that risk aversion is definitely there. In the AFI process, I didn't really see any evidence that tutors or people who were doing the selection were certainly taking things less seriously. And I don't think I saw any evidence that they were leaning more heavily one way or the other. Now, I don't really have a baseline for that. Right. I wasn't looking at like their practice in the mainstream round and then here. But in the discussions I've had with people, they've certainly not talked about it in any really different sense to the mainstream process. I think, yeah, what I would probably say about the interview process for the FY is that people were generally quite surprised at how strong the candidates were at interview. There was one subject exception, but I think in all of the other people I spoke to, there was a kind of like, oh, I didn't think they'd be able to do this. I can't really see as big a difference as I thought I'd be able to see. Like,
yeah. Rachel Crowell says not to ask this question, but she does raise the point sort of in like relates to yours, which is, are you comparing slightly different forms of admission because they're not quite the same thing?
Yeah, and I think it's not a direct comparison. So certainly not what the thesis does. So I think the way in which admissions were done for the AFY, I think raise and people's responses and conceptions of them raise interesting points about the mainstream process, and that's kind of the point. So yes, it is a different process, and that's kind of where lots of the interesting theoretical analysis comes from, because the fact it's different and the fact that my participants recognize it as kind of different and potentially doxically challenging to what happens in the mainstream process, I think tells us quite a lot about how they're conceptualizing the AFY. I think some of my participants would say, like, well, it's meant to be a different process, like that's the point. But I think one of the things that's interesting is from participants who were less involved in the process, weren't close to the admissions process for the AFY, there were lots of interesting assumptions being made about what was going to be happening. So some assumptions around the kind of rigor of the process, whether people were going to be kind of assessed in a way that would allow them to kind of flourish. There's another point I really want to make about that. So I have one participant who had a kind of fascinating lens on this. They were very strongly opposed to the foundation year, mostly on the grounds that it would kind of compromise the integrity of the tutorial teaching system. But what they kind of tell us is lots of the changes they've made to their pedagogic practice are actually really similar to the ones the AFY is doing anyway. So I think there's the fact that there's this conception of what's happening in the AFY, which either doesn't mirror reality or really closely does, but the participant hasn't realized, is interesting.
Good. Okay, we've got time for a couple more comments just online before we wrap up. As Elizabeth Ruckman asks about, did you have any examples of assessment disputes in relationship to academic autonomy and/or complaints or casework from students about the awards they received? That might have stretched your access a bit further than actually it went. Did you ever hear people talk about worrying? I mean, I guess you're interested in the foundation year process rather than.
Yeah, so certainly no casework. I didn't do anything related to individual students kind of profiles or applications. There was some interesting kind of discussion in some of the observations about I wouldn't say disputes, but kind of differences in how people thought assessment should take place. I don't have the data in front of me, and I don't think I can do it justice without it.
That's fine. So let's just look at the last couple of comments on the chat. Yojin Jiang asks, with regard to credential and contextual meritocracy, could students' nationalities and different cultures influence faculty perceptions on meritocracy during the course? If so, how do you think that might impact? How do you think the impact of internationalization might be influencing courses such as AFY?
Okay, really interesting. So no international students international students aren't eligible to take part in the AFY. So it wasn't a kind of factor in how the AFY's admissions processes or teaching processes were designed, because it is purely for UK students. There was some interesting data around the fact that many of the students who'd applied had kind of refugee backgrounds, and so had these kind of very non-standard, non-linear journeys through education, and that obviously influenced the kind of credentials which were available to assess. But that was kind of built into the foundation year's assessment process. There was a recognition that there would be a much broader and more diverse field of students who were applying through the nature of the program. I think this doesn't speak exactly to your question. Okay, two things to say, actually. So in the mainstream process, lots of tutors did mention international students and what they saw as a conflict between social justice for UK-based students and international students' admission. Essentially, because if you're able to pay in undergraduate international fees, you were almost certainly very wealthy. So they saw that this as a kind of like a potential clash or tension. The other thing around the point about kind of like uneven, and this doesn't speak to your question, but I think it's important, kind of uneven or non-standard credentials. One tutor described an admissions decision or conversation that they had had several years prior, where one of their colleagues looked at a student's profile and said, but they've got a D, how can we possibly admit them? And it was a D for distinction because the student had taken a BTEC. And I think that was just quite illuminating as to how diversity of qualification is kind of thought about in this context. So first, the not understanding what a D meant if you've done a BTEC, but also the just not even considering the fact that somebody might have done something that's not A-levels or IB.
Interesting. And the very last comment from Paola, OFS and access agreements, how might that have changed the relationship, the movement, the flow between credential and contextual meritocracy?
So, I mean, the OFS is absolutely, the introduction of the OFS and APPs is absolutely fundamental to this. So there's a kind of a glut of recent literature that discusses this. The people I would probably look at would be Vicky Bolivar and Mandy Powell at Durham, and Anna Manford-Zimders at Exeter, and their various co-authors. They identify like a strong link between the introduction of the OFS and a push towards more contextual admissions practices at most selective universities. In fact, there's a 2023 paper by Bolivar and Powell that discusses the fact that only it's Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, and maybe they're the only ones I can remember. There's 4 universities who don't now make contextual offers within the Russell Group. So Oxford is very unusual in not making contextual offers, right? And I don't think there's necessarily very much discussion of how unusual a position it's in with regards to even the rest of the very selective sector. So yeah, I think there's no way we'd be in this position without the introduction of the APPs. I don't think. But I also think the kind of precursor scheme, the Lady Margaret Hall Foundation Year, was absolutely integral to it as well. So almost all my participants kind of agreed we wouldn't be in this position if that scheme hadn't happened.
Good. Well, look, it sounds like we've come a long way for Oxford in 5 years, which is unusual for an institution to change, and probably there's going to carry on being changes. So we must get you back in 5 years' time, if not before, to see how this is evolving. Thank you all for coming and for asking really thoughtful questions, and thanks all for the comments in the chat. Eddie, given us a really deep and thoughtful analysis of your data. It's really exciting.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming in the room as well, and we look forward to reading more papers and hearing more about this work.
Great.
Well done.
Thanks very much.